Hi, it's Ron Coleman. I'm sitting in for Jenna again. It is my honor and pleasure to join you on the program today. There's so much news going on. Some of it is uplifting, some of it is depressing. There's some that is really consistently disappointing but illuminating that has come up in the last couple of weeks. And that's the whole issue of what's going on in the Ivy League. And I want to talk about the Ivy League and why it might actually matter more than people who are unfamiliar with it might appreciate. It's very easy for us to say, well, who cares? We're not involved with Harvard. We're not involved with the University of Pennsylvania. But in fact, we really are. What has obviously brought this to national attention has been the news about how the conflict in Gaza has given rise to this extraordinary and rather unpleasant explosion of anti-Israel protests by on campuses, and particularly and notably on some of the most prestigious campuses in the country. But these are not really political at all, or if they're political, the politics of them is not what they claim to be, because they're directed at students who are Jewish. They're directed at Jewish symbols. In fact, recently there has been a trend towards attacking Jewish menorahs. Only kind of menorah there is. Menorah is the Hebrew word, the Jewish Hebrew word for lamp. The root of it is ner, which means light. Menorah means a light, a fire. Not a light, a fire, a lighter or thingy, which has nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with contemporary Israel, nothing to do with Gaza. Attacks are taking place on schools, on the campuses of schools such as the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard, which are both in the Ivy League. We'll talk about what it really means to be in the Ivy League in a second, and have gotten rather violent. And there have been points at which Jewish students have felt physically intimidated and have been advised by many people on campus and off, interested in their safety and well-being, to hide their identity. Now, not everyone is capable of doing that. I think even if I took my little hat off, I wouldn't be very good at hiding my identity. But it's a shameful place. It's a shameful development that students should have this experience on these campuses. Early last week, the presidents of three of the most prominent universities in the United States, Harvard, Penn, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, testified before a congressional committee in the House. This is the House Workplace, no, Workforce and Education Committee. It's a very, very broad jurisdiction. And as everyone watching this probably knows by now, when asked whether these schools, all of which are known, especially Harvard, but also Penn, I don't know so much about what's going on at MIT, which is not, it's technically an Ivy League school. It's probably better than most of them, if not all of them, as an educational institution. But the questions that were asked included, given that these schools are all notorious for enforcing speech codes and for disciplining students who make others feel triggered, unsafe, threatened, why were such measures not put in place with respect to the treatment of Jewish students on these campuses who were treated to some rather vicious threats and statements? The president of the University of Pennsylvania and the president of Harvard and the president of MIT all middle-aged women, all answered that, well, it would depend on the context. You can't really call that threatening, can't really call that hate speech. And remember, hate speech is constitutionally protected. It absolutely is. You have a right to be a racist. You have a right to be an anti-Semite. You have a right to be a bigot of any kind you want. And you also have a right to express your bigoted opinions about others. That's okay. But private universities do have a certain amount of discretion to maintain the atmosphere in academic settings and in on their campuses and among their faculties. They can make their own rules. There are limits to this, and I'm not really going to explore the legal aspect of this, although those limits are much lower when it involves a state institution. In other words, a state-owned school, a public university. But these are all private universities, and students routinely and faculty are routinely disciplined for expressing unwoke speech. And these college presidents would not even condemn the speech. They would not even say that the expression of a genocidal intent, meaning from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, right now, from the river to the sea, there are several million Jewish people living in the state of Israel. What's supposed to happen to them? On October 7th, we got a pretty good idea of what is supposed to happen to them. None of these college administrators would acknowledge that this was nonetheless an improper expression according to the rules that they apply to everyone else on their campuses. Now, there is a very strong argument to get rid of these speech codes altogether, and I would endorse that. But we can't really believe that the time to change policy on free speech on campus is when policies that are supposedly meant to protect students from feeling unsafe and untriggered are directed at one particular group. You can have the discussion about changing the policies, but that would at the very least require that you enforce the policies that are in place now and announce a change for the future. It might also require you to take another look at discipline that has been meted out to faculty members, such as Amy Wax at the University of Pennsylvania, who has been de facto fired from her job teaching law there. One of the smartest people in the country, Amy Wax. People who have been thrown out of school for not playing well with others under the 21st century conception of, well, what you and I might call woke. Okay, that's the unfortunate truth. And Penn's president has resigned. It's fascinating, and it's part of where we're going to go in this commentary in discussing the Ivy League to understand what happened at Penn before we start talking about Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard. Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, is a member of the Ivy League. Don't confuse it with Penn State, the much larger and much more athletically dominant university, public university in Pennsylvania. The University of Pennsylvania is in Philadelphia. It's an Ivy League school. What are the Ivy League schools? Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Penn, Columbia, Brown, Cornell. Penn is not one of the most prestigious Ivy League schools. And prestige is very important in this discussion because it is one of the main benefits of attending one of these schools and getting a degree there. It is highly regarded, and it has historically been highly regarded for pretty good reasons. Prestige does have a tendency, and as we will see, or as we're seeing right now, not an absolute tendency, but there is a tendency to beget prestige. In other words, when people take pride in their institution, they live up to it. That's what esprit de corps is in a military organization. We're the Marines, we kick ass, we do what Marines do, whatever the case may be. That makes people step up. And people who attend these schools and people who teach at these schools tend to be very able, or at least they have until fairly recently. Penn, however, is, as I said, somewhat less prestigious. It is largely regarded in the Ivy League as the insurance Ivy League school. So, for example, someone who lives in my house turned down Penn to go to Hopkins because Hopkins is a better academic school and better suited her needs. One thing Penn does have, though, and Penn is a very big school and it's a wealthy school, but there's nothing more important at Penn than the Wharton School of Business. That's where Donald Trump went. The Wharton School is, along with the Harvard Business School, Chicago, a handful of other, let's say, top 5 business schools in the country, easily the gem in the crown of the University of Pennsylvania. So last week on Thursday, I believe it was on Thursday, could have been Wednesday night, but after that hearing, the the board decided not to fire President McGill of the University of Pennsylvania, despite her poor performance. Let's just stipulate to that. I'm not going to get into the details of it here. I don't think anyone thought it went well. In fact, it went so poorly that the next day she put out a video clarifying and extending her remarks, as we say. It looked like a hostage video. That was what a lot of people, including me, thought when they saw it. She looked as if she were, being told what she had to say in order to maintain her job. It worked, but it didn't work. She was able to keep her job by the lights of the Penn board, but that same night, I think it was Thursday night, Wharton's board, right? Each school of the university has its own supporters and its own board. Wharton's board wrote a letter, I think it was to the board at Penn, but it might have been to McGill herself, probably to the board at Penn, saying, we think she should go. And the next day she was gone. She resigned. She had read the tea leaves. They weren't hard to read. At Penn, when Wharton talks, Wharton is the school that graduates the biggest moneymakers at the University of Pennsylvania. It is the richest, the most prestigious school at Penn. They wanted no more part of her, and she was gone. How about Harvard? So Harvard has had a little bit different path. There isn't any one particular school at Harvard that dominates. Everything at Harvard is supposed to be glorious. Everything at Harvard is supposed to be the best. Harvard is historically regarded as the #1 most prestigious school in America. That may not really be true, but Harvard is sort of everywhere. It has a very large and very prominent and very old graduate schools, the law schools, the medical school, the business school, all these schools at Harvard have international reputations, and it is a massively wealthy institution. And its president, who was one of these mealy-mouthed apologists for expressions of Jewish genocide on a campus that brooks no tolerance for mean words. Their president is a woman named Claudine Gay, and she is facing apparently no or little danger of being removed in the foreseeable future. This has surprised very few people because the only reason Claudine Gay seems to have been appointed was because she was the best fit for a predetermined ethnic, gender, and ideological model that was the only one, it has now been documented, the only model of person. Did you know that there were models of people? Oh, there very much are. You know that. Who would be considered for the presidency of Harvard. Harvard is standing behind its affirmative action president, despite not only her poor performance at that congressional hearing, but also her, what is now appearing to be, according to most people who have taken a good look at the material, a person of a very undistinguished academic track record, speaking not only mediocrity, but very likely plagiarism, a great deal of plagiarism. I myself have not looked at the materials, and I'm not an expert on the plagiarism modality, but it seems to be a problem. All right, Ron. Okay, so what? What do I care? I would never send my kids there anyway, but we should care. I never applied to go to college at Harvard because my dream was to go to Princeton. And I got into Princeton. This was a pretty amazing thing to happen in my life. I didn't really know much about the world of colleges, the Ivy League. Neither of my parents had attended college at all. My father, of blessed memory, was a clerical worker. My mother was a secretary. My father actually was raised by his grandmother on the Lower East Side. She was an immigrant. My mother emigrated from Cuba to where her parents had emigrated from Poland, Jewish, in the 1950s. So they went from Poland in 1935 to Cuba, Cuba in 1956 to the United States. These are not what we call Ivy League legacy families. My parents were, and my mother is, intelligent people, but not particularly well-educated people. So for me to go to college, much less go to Princeton, was an extraordinary experience. So extraordinary, in fact, that when my parents brought me to college, brought me to university, the dormitories for freshman week at Princeton, which has a beautiful campus. And this is the fall of 1981. My father started crying. And my father was not a modern man. He wasn't wont to show his emotions, but he just couldn't believe the world that I was entering. I will tell you that my experience at Princeton was extraordinary. It transformed my life in ways that I will not go into here because it's too personal, and this is not meant as a personal blog, much less a therapy session. But I will tell you that I interacted with people from strata of society with whom I would have never imagined interacting. I got to do things using expensive grown-up toys like radio stations, performing, theater spaces, musical performing spaces, orchestras, all the things I love to do, and to be educated by world-class scholars with whom I had personal relationships. It was fantastic. And it opened doors for me for the rest of my life. Now, I was a little bit naive, as you could expect me to be, given the background that I've explained to you, about how attending a school like this will change your life. Once you become a Princeton man, you now are a Princeton man. And technically speaking, that's true. And it's mostly true to most of the world, but not necessarily to the other Princeton men. It took me a while to figure out that what these schools act as a reinforcing mechanism. Oh, there's a certain amount of funneling. If someone wants badly enough to be accepted by people that he never knew before, from neighborhoods he's never been to before, it can be done. But it was never my interest, never even really occurred to me. Princeton paid off for me in many ways, including as a networking resource. But I didn't become a Rockefeller. I didn't become really all that different from what I was before, except that the world now accepted me as somebody who had a Princeton degree. And again, it did open many doors for me. One of which was the door to religious faith, because when I first attended Princeton, I was from I still am from a secular Jewish family. And my roommate was an Orthodox Jew. I had never really had any personal relationships with Orthodox Jews before. Princeton had a very active Orthodox Jewish community. It had a kosher dining hall, which was actually very well respected, and regular daily services. We Orthodox Jews pray 3 times a day, and communal prayer is presumptively required. I observed this fellow who was my roommate observing Jewish life, observing the Sabbath and laws of kosher, while graduating pretty much with a full 1 point GPA higher than mine. And he is really, really smart. And I really didn't take academics all that seriously. If I ever had any conception that Orthodox Jews were medieval holdouts or something like that, or holdovers, it was dispelled by my experience with Matt and many others like him. Out in the world, though, even though I never really became a Princeton man quite the way I might have hoped to be, there was still always that network, so that you could reach out to someone solely on the basis of having both of you having gone to Princeton, almost on a cold call basis, to say, "Hi, I'm Ron Coleman. We both went to Princeton. I'm class of '85, and I see that you work in this field, or I see that you know about an opening in this law firm," whatever the case may be. There was a real sense of kinship, and it was based entirely on the merits for me. In other words, yes, these schools historically did admit people who were legacies, whose parents, typically their fathers, in my day, had attended Princeton or whatever the school might be, and these people would get favored treatment. But that is a long way from saying that there were no requirements for them, or that they were merely by virtue of being wealthy. There was no room for dummies or people who couldn't cut it academically in the Princeton that I knew in the 1980s. One of my classmates, in fact, was a woman named Michelle. She later became known as Michelle Obama. And the reason that I forgot her last name isn't because I once knew it. Even in the 1980s, Princeton, blacks on the Princeton campus largely segregated themselves from the mainstream of campus in institutions and locations that had been more or less set aside for that. Okay. We had our kosher kitchen. I didn't eat there then. Well, the point is, by the way, just to, footnote, finish the story. After observing this Orthodox fellow, I really came to realize that my non-observant Jewish lifestyle was not particularly meaningful, and that I nonetheless had a very strong pull towards a meaningful life as a Jewish person, as a Jew. And I ended up studying in Israel and becoming fully committed to Jewish practice. As I did that, my connection to Princeton began to weaken because it became increasingly obvious to me that besides not being truly accepted as a member of the network, I didn't really want to. Part of what made me go to study in Israel was that you can assimilate if you want, but you have to betray who you are to do that. And that was something that my parents instilled in me very strongly as something a person should never do. So I learned some finer points of behavior. I learned how to tie a bow tie because when I sang in the choir, we wore white tie and tails, and we had annual house parties, we called them, which were formal affairs in the spring. You had to learn how to, tie your own tie. It just was de rigueur at a place like Princeton. My connection withered and my interest withered, and my respect for the values of the institution became weaker because the community that I had now reattached myself to, which struck me as having much more consistently principled standards. Nonetheless, I always understood that Princeton had maintained high academic standards and that its faculty was well qualified and that principles of intellectual rigor and inquiry, including debate and dissent, were held in high esteem at Princeton as well. In the last few years, I saw that that had not become true, that that had become false. Princeton had become just another politically correct left-wing commune. Students have learned who dissent from the woke mentality. And look, even when I was there, I was a Republican activist, and I would put up posters for events that would be torn down. Reagan, bad, torn down. Nonetheless, that was considered to be sort of outside the pale. If we knew who had done it, we probably could have had that person disciplined. You don't bother with that. But what we see that's going on now is a complete crack up. Why does it matter to you now? Like you, I'm not going to send my children to Princeton. I had the extraordinary privilege, I will call it that, of attending what was at the time probably the greatest university in the country for undergraduates. And as I said, it was everything that I could have hoped for and more. But I would never expose my children to that environment. What we considered to be a wild time in the early 80s wouldn't even pass muster at an ordinary American public high school in 2023. The inversion of morality, the contempt for traditional conceptions of academic performance and merit and free thought are the rule, not the exception now. And I'm grateful not to have twinned my identity with being a Princeton man any longer than I did, and to have instead chosen a truly eternal and meaningful identity for myself as an individual, as a person, and again, as a member of the Jewish people and an observant Jew. But I must still reckon with the effects of Princeton and Harvard and Yale and even Penn on the world around me. In our law firm, we hire people. We can't merely look at a resume anymore and see that someone comes from an Ivy League school and assume that they're among the best for two reasons. One is that these schools have decided that academic performance as traditionally measured will no longer be as nearly as significant a factor in admissions decisions or grading as they once were. Moreover, any student who has who has stewed or been stewing in that intellectual environment for the last 7 years of his life, 4 years, is either going to be extraordinary because he will have come out of it with still something of a clear head, or will be someone we don't want to have around for two reasons. Politics, unfortunately, invades every space now. A workspace in an organization like the one where I work, where politically oriented legal cases are common. We have no reason to believe that such people are even capable of intellectual rigor, of dialectical thinking, intellectual honesty, or even really know what hard work is. It's happening in terms of the quality of the recruits. Candidates are and are not considered for advancement within the profession, and who is not nominated and confirmed to serve on the bench. You should shudder to think what that means for other institutions, such as the medical profession. You knew it was bad because you saw the entire medical profession that already existed, who had still been educated in the old ways, down on the job when they intoned about COVID policies that were irrational, anti-scientific, ignorant, socially harmful, and cruel. We have to reckon with the existence of elites. There's a difference between being a member of an elite and being an elitist. An elitist is someone who looks down his nose at others. You could still be a member of an elite and have the most gracious attitude toward other people. But if you're the best at something, or if you're in a position that enables you to exert an unusual amount of control over something, you're a member of the elite. These schools have remained until just now the absolute main source of elite talent in this country. This has very little to do with the Jews. How people, institutions, countries deal with the Jews usually ends up revealing the way they deal with all kinds of other human beings. The Harvard board stands behind Claudine Gay because they really have nowhere else to go. They have boxed themselves in. A black woman who was conspicuously hired despite her lack of any distinguishing qualification is ironically the most secure employee in the entire organization. That can't last. Anything that can't go on forever won't. This can't go on forever, and it won't. Supposedly, Harvard has already lost $1 billion in donations, mostly from Jewish alumni, but not entirely. It's not only because of the fact that they were disrespectful towards Jewish faculty and students in Cambridge. It's because they have revealed themselves to be undeserving of support. We need to keep an eye on these people, folks. I've been there. I'm grateful for the opportunity that I had. They're still running things. These are the people who run the FBI. These are the people who fill the Senate. These are the judges. These are the prosecutors. They're not listening to us. They listen to each other. We need to continue and maybe even step up our listening to them, not listening to what they say so that we know what to do, but listening to what they say that we know what they are, and so that we redouble our commitments to be who we are instead. Thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Ron Coleman. I have my own podcast. It's called Culmination, Completion, like what God does on the sixth day of creation. You can look me up. I'm on X, Ron Coleman. Thanks a lot for listening to my tale.